What's up, Echo.Church? It is great to be with you all today. For those of you that I've yet to meet, my name is Pattison. I lead a movement that started right here at Echo called Foster the City. About 7 years ago, we started rallying churches to come together to move towards kids and families in foster care. And we called that group of churches, that coalition of churches, Foster the City. And so when we started 7 years ago, we were one church. Today, 7 years later, there's 216 churches working together. Isn't that awesome? Across the Bay Area, down into Southern California, out into Northern Nevada, we are working together to raise up foster families and support for foster families until there is more than enough to meet the need. It's been so fun to be a part of. And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to each of you across all of our campuses for the way that you've helped to move this vision forward. Thank you for those of you who've become a foster parent. You become a support friend for a foster parent. You've been giving generously to this church to enable us to put more into the lives of kids and families in crisis. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It's making a difference. When we first started Foster the City 7 years ago, for about 4 days, I thought we were brilliant. I thought we had done something completely unprecedented, innovative. We were pioneers, I thought, for about 4 days, and then I went on Google. And I realized there was actually movements like Foster the City happening all over the country. Churches were coming together in these unprecedented ways and moving towards vulnerable kids and families. That did a couple things. Number one, it humbled me a little bit because I realized I'm not quite as innovative as I thought I was. Number two, though, it lit me up. Because I realized, man, we're part of something much bigger than ourselves. Like the Holy Spirit is stirring up His people, His church, to move towards kids and families in these really huge ways. And we get to be a part of that. How cool is that? We were not the pioneers. But there was a pioneer. Can I tell you about him? His name is Bishop Aaron Blake. This is him here. This is Bishop Blake. Bishop Blake, in 2001, was pastoring a tiny little congregation in Brownwood, Texas. He was bivocational, so he was also the at-risk counselor at his local high school. And he was the kind of counselor that had kids coming in and out of his office all throughout the week. One of those kids was a boy named Melvin Johnson. He was on the high school football team. Melvin Johnson. Melvin was in the foster care system. Been bounced around from house to house to house. 5 different times he was bounced around houses. And at one point, found himself in Bishop Blake's office and just tears streaming down his face and just telling the bishop his story and about yet another failed placement. And Bishop Blake just listened and said, man, if there's anything I could do, I would. If there's anything, I wish I could take you home. I wish you could come and live with me. I'm so sorry. And Melvin said, really? I could come live with you? And he said, I'd take you in a heartbeat, right? And so Melvin wiped the tears from his eyes and went on with his day, and Bishop Blake went on with his day. And you know where this is going. Bishop Blake got a call from a social worker not long after that and said, hey, Bishop, I'm here with a boy named Melvin, and he said that you said he can come live with you. And so Bishop Blake kind of sputtered and stammered, and he said, well, I'm going to need to talk to my wife about that. And so he called his wife, Mary, and he said, Mary, remember that boy Melvin from school? And he told her what the social worker had asked, and then he just waited with held breath about how she'd respond. You know what she said? She said, Aaron, I sure hope you told them yes. Isn't that awesome? So Melvin came to live with the Blakes. Not long after that, the tight end from the football team lost his foster placement, needed a home. And Melvin said, well, you come live with us in the Blakes. And then the fullback needed a home. And then the other fullback needed a home. And then the defensive back needed a home. Before long, 6 teenage boys were in the Blake home. 6 high school football players were with the Blakes. And listen, every time that one of these boys would come to go live with the Blakes, before Bishop Blake would let them in the door, he would stand out with them on the sidewalk. And he would tell each of the boys, he'd look them in the eye and say, listen, when you walk through that front door, you're a part of my family. You're a part of my family. You are, what's mine is yours. I'm going to love you. I'm going to treat you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to provide for you as if you are my own flesh and blood. You're being grafted into this family when you walk through that door. And those weren't just words. Like that was tested countless times, including one night when everything was changed for these boys. Middle of the night, one of the boys was in his room, and he was playing with matches. and curtains caught on fire. Within minutes, the entire Blake family was out on the sidewalk watching their house burn to the ground. That was the house where they'd raised their biological kids. That was the house where they had, countless memories and pictures and treasured possessions, watching it burn to the ground. And Bishop Blake says that he was standing there and he was just thinking about his wife standing next to him. What did I ask her to do? Look at this cost. Does she regret saying yes to these boys? He was just so concerned about Mary. You know what Mary did, though? After watching her house burn to the ground, she simply looked over at her husband and said, well, we better get to Walmart. The boys have school in the morning. They're going to need some stuff. And so at 2 a.m, they found themselves wandering through the aisles of Walmart, picking up school supplies and clothes for the next day. But you know what? The next day came and the boys cut their classes. Because the boys were sure that day the social workers were going to show up like they had in the past. They were going to show up in their classrooms to tell them that they'd lost another placement. Because surely they'd crossed the line. The Blakes were going to be kicking them out this time. And so they went and they hid so that the social workers couldn't find them. But it wasn't the social worker who went to go find them. It was Bishop Blake. And he brought them back to the hotel where they were staying. And he said, boys, I told you, you are grafted into this family and nothing is going to change that. And that night he held an informal adoption ceremony for those boys in the hotel room. Isn't that incredible? But the story doesn't end there. Because Bishop Blake and Mary Blake, they had come face to face with the reality that there were kids like those boys who needed unconditional love, who needed attachment. And they found out that there weren't enough loving homes in their area for kids like that. And so one Sunday morning, Bishop Blake stood in front of his congregation, and he looked out and he shared with his congregation this need. And he said, who will stand with us for the vulnerable? Who will stand with us for kids like these, kids who are lonely, kids who are wounded? Who will stand with us? And guess what? A woman stood up, and she said, I will, Bishop. And then another woman in their little congregation stood up and said, I will. And then another one stood up. And their tiny little congregation, they found 15 new foster families. And 39 kids from foster care entered their congregation, their little congregation. And then churches in the area were inspired by that. And they started doing the same thing. They joined, they linked arms together and started raising up foster families. And in 2004, there were more than enough families. There was a waiting list of families in Brown County, Texas, rather than a waiting list of kids in need of a home. And they've worked together every year since then to make sure it stays that way. Isn't that awesome? Guys, those are the pioneers. Those are the footsteps that we're following. How inspiring is that? My guess is that as I share that story with you, not one of you, in your heart and mind, not one of you had this thought, what a fool he was to say yes to those boys. It cost him his house. What a fool. Not one of you, I bet, thought that across all of our campuses. You know what I bet was happening inside of you as I share that story? There's something that starts to well up in you. When you hear stories like that, there's something that there's a longing that rises up within you that says, that is a life well lived. Right? Man, I wish I lived a life like that. Do you know how I know that of you? Because that's what you were made for. That's what you were made for, and that's what I was made for. Like God said to Abraham in the Old Testament, he said, you are blessed that you might be a blessing. We've been in a series the last few weeks here at Echo, talking all about what it looks like for God's transforming work to touch us. But that transforming work that he does in each one of our hearts was never meant to terminate on us. Right? That transforming work that starts right here eventually begins to spill out of us, overflow out of us into the world around us. Right? We've all heard that expression, hurt people, right? But it's also true that healed people heal people. Transformed people transform people. Right? That the way in which God has moved towards us when we were vulnerable, when we were in need, we now get the chance to do the same for those around us. And what I want to do today is I want to look at a passage in Scripture, in the book of Luke. I want to look at a story that's very similar to the Blakes. Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. I want us to read this and see what God has to share with us about transforming love. Let me read this over us today. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, what's written in the law? Jesus replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you'll live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him, went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. And when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said. And when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Okay, there are a few things I want to pull out of this parable today. First, Jesus gives us a mandate. And the mandate is simple. It's to see and have compassion. To see and to care. Because, again, he says in this story, the Levite, the priest, they come and they see the man in front of them. But they don't see with compassion. They see with indifference. In fact, they actively go out of their way to avoid the man, which of course we know is heartbreaking. We know the priest, the Levite, right? These are the varsity level religious leaders of the day. Better than anybody in their community, they would have known God's word. They would have known God's heart for the vulnerable. And yet their knowledge of God, their information was simply that. It was this abstract, disembodied knowledge, not something that was transforming them into people of love and of action. Their understanding of God did not move them into anything concrete. It stayed abstract. I think of it like this. Golden State Warriors back at it today, 5:30 p.m. against the Lakers. I know it's preseason. I don't care. Basketball's back. Yes, we can cheer for that. I'm so excited. I love watching the Warriors. I love watching the Niners. We get 2 games today, guys, back to back, doubleheader. Right? I love watching sports. I especially love watching sports with my kids. My 8-year-old son in particular, Gabriel, he gets just as excited as I do about the games. One of the reasons I love watching sports with my son Gabe is because my son, we have never watched one single game where we've made it past halftime where he hasn't asked to actually go out and play the game. I love that. Right? He watches the game. He gets so excited, and it inspires him, and it hypes him up, and he's just got to go out and do it. We've got to go play one-on-one. We've got to go out and throw the football around. I love that because we so easily lose that, don't we? Right? We get so contented with just sitting on the couch and wearing a jersey. Right? Learning the learning the players' names, right? Like learning the plays, understanding the nuance and the drama of the team, and right? And but our knowledge and our passion for the game so often doesn't compel us to actually go out and play, to go actually do it. Right? We're happy to talk about it, debate about it, critique it, but we don't actually go out and participate. And that was exactly what was happening with this Levite and the priest. Right? They had learned the Bible stories. They knew the Bible characters' names. They had memorized massive chunks of the scriptures by heart. They knew they wore the right clothes. They spoke the right language. They debated about it. They understood the nuance to it, but it wasn't turning them into people of actual, true, concrete love and action. Martin Luther King Jr. says it like this. He says, in the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which makes a strange distinction between body and soul, the sacred and the secular. Can I tell you what I think he's saying? He's saying Jesus didn't just come to preach to the poor. He also came to lift up the poor. Jesus doesn't just care about our spiritual poverty and our spiritual brokenness. He also cares about our physical brokenness. A disembodied, abstract faith is not found in the Bible. It's not. It is lived on the ground, in the streets, in our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces. The question is, what will we do with the needs that we see in front of us? Here's the reality. Across the regions where Foster the City is serving right now, there are tens of thousands of kids in foster care. 1 out of 3 will end up on the streets. About half will develop a substance addiction. Suicidal tendencies for kids in foster care are 4 times higher than that of the average youth. 4 times. 3 out of 5 kids that we're rescuing from human trafficking here in the state, so 3 out of 5 kids that are being sexually exploited right now that we're rescuing domestically come directly from the foster care system. 60%. I could just spend the rest of our morning telling you stat after stat after stat after stat, but here's what we need to understand. These aren't just stats, these are stories. Every one of these numbers has a name attached to it. Every number has a name, every name has a story, every story matters to God. I just heard about a couple of kids down south that have been in a government facility. This is a little 3-year-old boy and an 8-year-old little girl. That they've been in a government facility for more than 9 months because they can't find a home for them. 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, 9 months without family. This 3-year-old is so developmentally delayed, he can't walk yet. This 8-year-old little girl has had to be mom to her little brother for so much of her life that she literally doesn't play. She doesn't play with toys. She doesn't play on the playground. Her brain has been wired to be caregiver rather than child. Who will open their home and bring this little 3-year-old in and teach him how to walk? Who will bring this little 8-year-old home and teach her how to be a child, how to play? What will we do with the needs that we see in front of us? Jesus is saying, move towards those needs and stop with the indifference. Move towards it in compassion and in action. And that's exactly what we see this Good Samaritan do. He moves towards in compassion. First thing we saw was the mandate. The second thing we see here is the measure of this Samaritan's love. This is what he does. First thing he does is he puts himself at risk. He puts himself at risk. Now, we know that this story that Jesus is telling us, it's a parable, right? Which means it's fiction. It's a fictional story, right? Told to convey some truths to us. But Jesus does something really unique here because he tells this parable, this fictional story, but he puts it in a real setting, in an actual place, right? He says that there's this man going down this particular road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and everybody who's listening would have known exactly where Jesus was talking about because that road, that stretch of road was infamous. It was called the Bloody Way or the Pass of Blood, because it was so common for people to get jumped on that road. Okay, so when the listeners heard that the Levite and the priest, they quickly went past, that would have made sense to everybody listening, because, well, of course they did. If they would have stopped, they probably would have gotten jumped. It makes sense. It would be irresponsible, foolish even, to stop and help the man. But listen to what Jesus is saying. He's saying, no. He said, I am calling you to inconvenience yourself, or even, if need be, put yourself in harm's way if that's what your neighbor needs. That's the kind of love that Jesus is showing us here. I am calling you to inconvenience yourself, or even, if need be, choose to put yourself in harm's way if that's what your neighbor needs. This is so counterintuitive to a culture like ours that so values self-preservation. The question that comes to my mind when I see somebody in need, whether it's just somebody out on the street, if it's a friend who's having a hard time, if it's a kid in foster care, the question that comes to my mind is, what will this cost me? If I say yes to this, is it going to cost me my time, my money, my sense of well-being or security, my plans, my ambitions? What is this going to cost me if I say yes to this thing? When we navigate foster care with families who are considering it, we often have to wrestle through these very concerns. People will ask us, my wife and I, we've been fostering for 7-8 years. They'll ask us, isn't it hard? What's that cost to your family? Isn't it hard to say goodbye to the kids you've gotten attached to? They're with you for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Isn't that difficult to say goodbye? You want to know the answer to that? Yeah, it's difficult. Rips your heart out. The grief is real. They say, well, what about when the kids come into your home and, they're coming from hard places? So, what about the times when, maybe they act out or they misbehave? Is that hard? Absolutely, it's hard. Listen, every person, all of our campuses, we all act out of the trauma that we've experienced in our life. Every one of us. And oftentimes these kids have gone through significantly more trauma than you and I ever will. So yes, do they act out of that? Sometimes they do. In their grief, in their pain, in their loneliness, they will act out of that. And that can be really hard. Actually, my wife and I, we're third generation foster parents. So my parents fostered and their parents fostered. And so I grew up with foster brothers and sisters coming in and out of the home. And if I'm honest, probably the most difficult moments of my childhood came as a direct result of being a foster family. I remember tears. I remember frustrations and challenges. I remember physical attacks against my mom. I remember the days when my parents separated because of the strain that it put on their marriage. It was hard. But for every challenging, difficult moment, there were 99 others where I watched my parents love with compassion, with grit, with concrete action. And it so inspired me growing up that I just do I want that to be part of my story too. I'm standing here today because my parents were willing to put themselves, if need be, in harm's way to move towards their neighbor in need. So he puts himself at risk. But secondly, the Samaritan doesn't just put himself at risk to help a dying man. He put himself at risk to help an enemy. Many of you know this, but the Jews and Samaritans hated each other with a special kind of hatred. It was actually common practice. It was common practice for the Jews to regularly pray that God would not hear the prayers of the Samaritans. They would pray and ask God not to forgive the Samaritans because they wanted to make sure there would be no Samaritans in the resurrection. They wanted to make sure every Samaritan spent eternity in hell. So they would go to the temple, and in a temple liturgy, they would actually pray together as a community against the Samaritan people. That is a special kind of hatred. So I can just imagine a Samaritan coming down the road, seeing a Jewish man lying on the ground, beaten up, half dead, bloodied, broken. And the temptation to just come up and say, dude, serves you right. After all you've done against me, after all your prayers against me, after all your oppression, you do not deserve my help. Serves you right. And if I'm totally honest with you, this right here is probably my greatest obstacle to helping people in need. Is I ask that question, do they deserve my help? I'm ashamed to say that, but that's true. When I see somebody in need, my heart makes an immediate assumption about why they're in that place. My brain feels like it's wired to just quickly make an assumption. Here's why you're in the position you're in. It's because you made some bad choices, dude. You know, if they wouldn't have made those bad decisions, they wouldn't be there. You know, I bet they didn't work hard enough. I bet they're dangerous. I probably shouldn't help them. I bet you it's because of drugs. If I helped them, it would be enabling them. If I helped them, it'd be a waste of my time, waste of my resources. Am I the only one? And we justify why they don't deserve our help. But Jesus will not stand for that. He won't stand for it. In fact, I always imagine when I read this story, when the expert of the law actually says, who is it that I have to love? Like, who is my neighbor? I can just imagine Jesus bristling at that question. Because Jesus will not carve up humanity into those who are and who are not worthy of love. Tim Keller, in his book, Generous Justice, he said it like this. He said, by depicting a Samaritan helping a Jew, Jesus could not have found a more forceful way to say that anyone at all in need, regardless of their race, politics, class, and religion, is your neighbor. This Samaritan put himself in harm's way, moved towards his enemy, and then finally we see how generously he gave his own resources. He gave his own resources. The Samaritan took what he had. Right? When he came up on the man, he got down from his donkey, he got into the dirt with him, he took what he had, his resources, his wine and his oil, and he would have used those to clean and to disinfect the wounds. And then he gently bound up the broken body and lifted the man up and put him on his own donkey and then took him to an inn and then stayed overnight with him to make sure that he would regain consciousness. And then he gave his own money. He took 2 denarii. Guys, that's the equivalent of 2 months' rent. Gave it to the innkeeper. He said, I want to make sure that this man has everything he needs, all the time and the resources that he needs to get better. This is the kind of generosity and compassion that you and I are being called into. Jesus says, go and do likewise. I want to share with you a story real quick about a family who did just that, who opened up their home and their lives and their resources with someone who's in need and the lives that were changed. Go ahead and watch this video.
I remember taking a pipe and just putting it on the floor and just stepping on it. And I was like, I'm done. And a month later, Madison was born on her due date, which I don't know how that happened because I had done everything you're not supposed to do while you're pregnant. And on the third day, they took my daughter and they said, we'll be right back. And they never came back. I went down almost every street around the hotel and just cried and just didn't know where to go. And I didn't want to go back to the motel because I had my room in the motel all set up with a crib and clothes. I just felt so alone and lost.
I was advised to be cordial but confidential because the bio mom was hostile to the first foster parents, and so obviously not really what I wanted to hear. They said be confidential, so I thought, is it bad if she even knows my name? So when I met Lauren, I didn't know what to expect, but as soon as we started talking, she felt at ease with me.
I was on my first unsupervised visit with my daughter. I was feeling so nervous. I have my daughter, and we can go wherever we want, and we can be back at this certain time. We can spend this time alone that I haven't had. She goes in my car, and we're driving, and Madison starts crying. And she starts crying and crying and crying, and I start crying, and we're both holding each other, and we're just crying, and I knew she didn't want me. So I met them at Trader Joe's parking lot, and we're in the parking lot, and I'm just crying and holding Madison, and Brian puts his hands over me while I'm crying, and he prayed for me. And I don't know what he said, but when he was done, all the guilt was taken away. All the guilt was taken away. Because when she was crying, it wasn't just a kid crying. All I heard was everything I did while I was pregnant. Everything I did to put her in a position to be crying.
Well, when we first got into foster care, or we thought we were going to start doing it, it was just, the focus was just all about the children and about, saving children. We didn't have any other really focus until we went through our agency's training, which was really good. And they kind of like enfolded us into the whole process of dealing with, there's a family that's broken, and you're there not just for the children, but there's an entire family that's out there that's going to be hurting.
Out of the blue, I got a text message from her, which made me cry. She had just texted me, Bethany, I need God and I want Madison to know Jesus. And I'm like, I called her right away. I was like, we gotta talk about, you're making me cry. She's like, why? And I'm like, because this is absolutely amazing. And then to hear how God has just been working on her heart, it was exciting. And she wanted to learn more. She's hungry and thirsty, and so we've been doing Bible study together. She started going to church. She found one. They got connected in there, and so it's been amazing to see God at work.
They were my support. Bethany and Brian were my main support throughout this whole case after they got Madison. They carried me. They believed in me. My relationship with them is still growing, and I love them so much. I consider them to be my family. I get my advice from Bethany. I watch her family because I want what she has, and I want what her family has, and I want how her family is. I want that for my family.
You think about walk by faith and not by sight. And going into fostering, we had a lot of questions. We had a lot of doubts, concerns, fear. There's a whole lot of emotions, and you almost don't want to do it, but you want to do it. And the things we feared most, I feel like didn't come to pass. We were so afraid that it would blow up on our faces and that it would be the worst experience ever for our family. And it hasn't been that way. I think we're always afraid to obey the Lord because we don't know what the cost will be. But in following Christ, the cost is always worth it. It really ends up being no cost. I'm like, we've gained more than had to, put out kind of thing. And God is always so gracious in that way. So, I don't know why we get so afraid. But yeah, we do. And we're going to continue to grow in those things. But God is so kind. He is so kind in his dealings with us.
What is God leading you to invest in the lives of those around you? Do you have some love to give? Maybe a little extra room in your house. Maybe God is calling you to learn a little bit more about becoming a foster parent. Do you have maybe some extra time, some extra capacity? You can maybe drop a meal off to a family. You can mow a lawn. You could babysit. You can pray for someone. You can encourage them. Maybe God's calling you to be a support friend for a foster family. Do you have a little margin financially? Maybe you can start giving towards Echo Compassion. As you give towards Echo Compassion, we can do more for kids and families in crisis. What's God calling you to do? If you're interested in getting involved with Foster the City in any way, your next step is very simple. It's to go out to our table at all of our campuses. We have a table out in the lobby where you can fill out a next step card. And when you fill out this next step card, all we're going to do is this week we're going to send you an email about an interest meeting that we have coming up where you can learn more about the different ways you can get involved. If you're watching online today, you can just simply go to fosterthecity.org and you can sign up there. Okay, that's your next step. We've talked today about what our mandate is as followers of Jesus, what the measure of love to which he's calling us. But I have one final thought, and that is the means of this love. Because listen, I know I'm up against it on time, but if we stop here, all that I will have managed to do is to place on your shoulders a burden that is too heavy for any of us to bear. When I have read over the years Luke chapter 10, this story, this Good Samaritan story, it has not inspired me, honestly. It has not inspired me or liberated me to live a life of service and compassion. It has crushed me. That's what it feels like to me. It feels crushing, this picture of love to which God is calling us. It's only recently that I feel like I'm just now starting to understand that I think I've been reading this parable all wrong. Please lean in and please hear me in this. The key to understanding this parable is where the Jewish man is placed in the story. Lean in, please, for a moment. We have to get this. The key to understanding this parable is where Jesus places the Jewish man in the story. If you guys remember, the expert in the law asked Jesus, "What do I have to do to be saved? What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Who do I have to love? Who is my neighbor? Who do I have to love in order to be able to be saved?" And if Jesus would have responded, okay, Jewish man, you're on the donkey, and you're going down there, and there's a Samaritan on the ground, and he's beaten, and he's bloody, and he's half dead, he's broken. When you see that person, even that Samaritan is your neighbor. I want you to reach down. I want you to care for him, be generous towards him. Don't be a racist. Don't be classist. I want you to be generous towards him. Even the Samaritan is your neighbor. That would have actually made sense based on the question, who is my neighbor? Even the Samaritan is your neighbor. But that's not what Jesus did. He flipped it. He put the Jewish man on the ground and the Samaritan on the donkey. So here's what I think Jesus was wanting us to know. He said, do you really want to know how you are saved? Do you really want to know how to inherit eternal life? Then you need to understand that you are that man on the ground. You are the man on the ground, beaten, bloodied, broken, helpless. And what you need is somebody to come along, somebody who you once saw as an enemy, reach down and help you and lift you up. You need somebody who you once saw as an enemy reach down to save you. So friends, listen. This expert in the law had spent his entire life trying to work his way to God. What must I do to be saved? Am I following the law well? Am I being obedient? Am I doing enough good works? And I so resonate with this man. I so resonate with this. Am I a good enough person yet? Have I done enough good? Have I loved well enough? Am I managing my sin well enough today? I so resonate with this. There's actually a prayer. I wrote down a prayer that I pray every single morning. And a couple lines of those prayers, of that prayer is I say this. I say, God, help me to see today that there is no accomplishment that will make you love me more. And help me to see today that there is no mistake that I could make that will cause you to love me less. I have to pray that prayer every single day because it's so easy for me to fall back into the lie that I have to work my way to God. But listen, Jesus is not telling the man, and he is not telling you and me that if you want to be saved, you have to become a good Samaritan. Jesus is saying, I need you to see, I am the good Samaritan. I am the good Samaritan. I've come to where you are, and I see you. And I know you feel helpless and hopeless, and you feel beaten up and broken down, not alive. But I see you where you are, and I'm coming towards you. And I'm going to get in the dirt with you, not just at the chance of harm being done to me, but knowing it will cost me my life. I'm coming towards you, and I'm coming with my wine and my oil, my blood and the Spirit. And I'm coming to make you alive. Jesus is the Good Samaritan. You and I could never be a Good Samaritan until we see that we need a Good Samaritan. Can I say that? If you don't get anything else, get this one thing. You and I can never become a Good Samaritan until we see that we first need and have a Good Samaritan. But when we do see that, when we get that, when we now see people in front of us who are beaten and bloodied and broken, we can understand that we're looking in a mirror. And we don't look down on them anymore. How could we? We can't judge them anymore. We can't be uncallous, or we can't be callous towards them anymore, or uncaring towards them anymore. Because we can look at them and say, oh, that was me. That was my story. It's only when we see Jesus as our Good Samaritan that we can, bit by bit, become like the Good Samaritan. Let me close with this. Every time I read a Bible story, I kind of place myself in that story. Do you do that? Like, who do I resonate with? Am I like the disciple? Am I like the Pharisee? Am I like the Levite or the priest? I'm too much like the Levite and the priest. I told you, Jesus is the Good Samaritan in this story. That's how I see this story. I once was the man on the ground, but he lifted me up. He didn't keep me there. Do you know who I resonate the most with right now in this story? The innkeeper. The innkeeper. Because Jesus, my Good Samaritan, is bringing people to me. And he's asking me to care for them. And like the Good Samaritan with the 2 denarii, he has given me all the resources that I need to care for the people with whom he's entrusted me. And one day, he's coming back. And I'm going to have to give an account for how I did with caring for those that he trusted me with. And I think the same might be true for many of you today. So I know I've never had 6 teenage boys in my house. I've never had my house burnt down, but I am going to follow the footsteps of Bishop Blake. And I'm going to say, who is going to stand with us for the vulnerable? Who will stand for the lonely and for the wounded? Whether it's through Foster the City, whether it's through Echo.Compassion, whether it's somebody who simply crosses your path, will you be a person who sees and sees with compassion? No longer content with indifference. Will you see and will you see with compassion and move towards them in their need? Would you bow your heads with me? In a moment, I'm going to pray. Before we do that, let me say this. I know that across all of our campuses, we have people here that have been coming and been a part of Echo, even following Jesus for a long time. But we also have across all of our campuses folks who are just exploring. You're here for the first time, or you've been coming for a little while, and you're just exploring who this Jesus is right now. And maybe as you hear this story and we talk about the seasons of life when we are that man on the ground, maybe you resonate with that today. You're not resonating with the innkeeper. You're resonating with that man who was beaten and bloodied and on the ground. Things do feel hopeless. Things do feel helpless right now. You feel beat up. If that's you today, I want to ask you, with every head bowed, every eye closed, I want to ask you to do something for me. I want you to place yourself in your imagination. I want you to place yourself in that scene on that road. You're laying on the ground. You feel beat up. You feel alone. And then I want you to see Jesus, the Good Samaritan, coming down the road. And he sees you. I want you to see, in your mind, I want you to see Jesus coming down off that donkey and getting into the dirt with you, kneeling over you. Do you see it? How is he looking at you right now? How is he looking at you? Imagine him now as he is just gently in his kindness, tending to your wounds. Friends, you're not alone anymore. Hope is here. Help is here. The Good Samaritan is here, and his name is Jesus. In just a moment, across all of our campuses, we're going to remember the work of our Good Samaritan. We're going to do this through communion. The bread at the stations across all of our campuses, they represent the body that was broken on the cross that brings us life. The juice, it reminds us of the blood that was shed for us on the cross. So in just a moment as we sing this song, I'm going to invite at all of our campuses for you to go to one of those stations. If you've placed your faith in Jesus, come and participate in this. Take the bread, you can dip it into the juice, and again, go back and you can take it when you're ready, after you've taken some time just to remember and to thank God for his grace. God, we thank you so much for your goodness to us. We thank you for your love and your grace that was not just words, but you put it into action. You came and you met us in our brokenness and in our need. We love you. We are so grateful for meeting us in that place. And God, we pray that this grace that we've experienced, this transforming work in us, that it would overflow out of us. You'd help us to see those in need around us with different eyes, knowing that was our story too. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you again so much for joining us today. We hope that you found this helpful, and if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest content that we have for you. Also, we are dependent on the financial contributions of others to support and sustain our ministry, so be sure to go to Echo.Church/give if you feel led to participate so that we can continue making an impact together. Thank you so much again, and we'll see you next time.